Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has opened the ShangriLa Dialogue with a speech outlining his vision for the Indo Pacific. As India, China and the United States, as well as others, consider their strategic security and economic interests in the region, I'm very happy today to be able to speak with Rahul Roy Chaudhury, who heads the South Asia program of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the sponsor of the ShangriLa Dialogue in Singapore. We'll get his analysis of Prime Minister Modi's answers and views, the key issues in regional security, the key players in the competition, and more. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui at the ShangriLa Dialogue in Singapore. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Roy Chaudhury. Prime Minister Modi opened the ShangriLa Dialogue with an outline for the vision on the Indo Pacific. What do you think are the essential points that he presented?
Prime Minister Modi made a very important statement at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. For the first time, an Indian Prime Minister has talked about his vision for Indo-Pacific security. And there were three key elements for this vision. The first is the definition of the Indo-Pacific. And the Prime Minister made it very clear that he defines the Indo-Pacific as spreading from the shores of East Africa to America, which is different from other perceptions of other countries of the Indo-Pacific. The second point was that he made it very clear that he was focusing on Indo-Pacific that was open, stable, secure and prosperous. An Indo-Pacific that had principles of law behind it and the freedom of navigation and overflight. And the third important aspect was he made it very clear that as a region and as India's role in the Indo-Pacific was not against any country, there was not any alignment of countries or coalition of countries against any, and it was going to be an inclusive, prosperous and economically focused Indo-Pacific region.
How did he assess the threats in this region?
He assessed it, I think, in two or three ways. The first threat was the concern over disruption of navigation, especially in terms of trade. India has increasing trade links east of the Straits of Malacca from Indian ports with its partners in Japan, South Korea. And there was concern that any disruption of trade could affect the openness and the free aspect of the Indo-Pacific. The second issue he raised was very briefly, but concerns over terrorism in the broad region. And I think thirdly, he mentioned cybersecurity issues, which was not directly linked to the Indo-Pacific, but was a concern that India is increasingly having.
Prime Minister Modi came over to attend the SCO summit in Xiamen at the most difficult time following the Doklam crisis, and he met with President Xi Jinping in Wuhan. That would quickly be followed by a summit of SCO in Qingdao on the sidelines. So what kind of consensus have the two sides reached concerning our bilateral relationship within the broad context of the Indo-Pacific Ocean?
I think it's very important to understand the nature of the two leaders. Both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi are decisive leaders, they're powerful leaders, and I think it's very important for them to establish a personal relationship, a chemistry of sorts, if possible. And that, I think, was the main purpose of the Wuhan informal summit that the two took part in. For Prime Minister Modi, it was not an outcomes-based summit, it was an understanding-based summit, to be able to try to understand each other's positions and see how they could work forward. So my sense is that it's very important for both the leaders to meet, to talk about these issues and see how they can overcome the differences, because there are areas of cooperation between India and China, particularly on regional and global matters, but there are also concerns that both have of each other.
How serious is the challenge concerning border disputes since 1962? Because out of 14 countries we share land border, only 2 failed to solve the problem of, the border the border issues. How serious are the challenges, and what kind of agreement has been reached between the two militaries to avert the crisis that we had last year in Doklam?
I think it is a serious issue. The border between India and China is undemarcated. It is not clear on maps where it is, which is why on the Indian side it is called the line of actual control. But this has been, as you said yourself, this has been a long-standing dispute since 1962. I think what is most important, and that is my sense that both countries are working towards, is to ensure the stability of the border rather than a resolution of the border dispute between the two countries. So it's very important to ensure a stable border, which is the reason why I think the Wuhan summit was important, because both countries now do feel that it is important to ensure that there are no misperceptions, misunderstandings on both sides on the border, and to have a communication between the two to ease the bilateral tension. So the border issues are very important, but I don't see any early solution, and I think the border management is the most important. Having said that, this has been a largely peaceful border. There have been no shots fired across the border for decades, and there have been scuffles, there have been standoffs. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that though there are challenges to border management, it is not a border that is live and where firing takes place in relation to India's other borders with Pakistan, but actually there is daily intensified firing across the line of control. And the
your territorial disputes with the neighboring country Pakistan in South Asia do embarrass China. If you look at the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, what do you think of the Chinese position on the standoff between Pakistan and India?
I think that for India it is very important to see what China's position is in relation to India's disputes with Pakistan. In the past, I think that there has been sort of a mixed relationship on this issue. When India and Pakistan had a conflict in Kargil in the late 1990s, it was notable that China took a neutral stand on this issue, and that came as a sense of encouragement to India. So there is a very strong relationship between China and Pakistan, but at the same time for India it is important to ensure that the India-China relationship is seen in a more positive way, especially in terms of crisis that India may have with Pakistan.
What do you think of the issue of the Dalai Lama and the future of Tibet?
You know, the Dalai Lama has come into India and has been given refugee status. He is in Dharamsala in northern India. There is, for the last few months, a very clear decision by the Indian government to lower some of the rhetoric from the Tibetan side, especially as 2018-2019 are important years in terms of celebrating the anniversaries of the Dalai Lama's movement into India. So I think both countries do realize that this is an issue that could have serious implications, but I think for India this is not seen from the Indian perspective as a political issue. It is a humanitarian issue.
And what about the future of being a member of the nuclear suppliers group? China disagrees.
Yes.
Because you are not a party to the NPT.
Yes. Yes, you're right. I mean, China has disagreed. India is very keen to become a member of the nuclear suppliers group. But at the same time, you know, we have to look at areas where there could be potential cooperation. One important area, for example, is in terms of counterterrorism, where there could be better prospects for India and China to work together. Both have concerns over terrorism for their own reasons in the region. We've seen that both India and China have worked very well together in two particular areas. One is in terms of the Financial Action Task Force that has met recently and has talked about Pakistan, particularly in terms of grey listing Pakistan, because it hasn't done enough to prevent sources of funding for terror groups in Pakistan. India and China worked together very closely on this, and China supported the Indian position. We had a similar example of this in a meeting of the BRICS, where countries came together of the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to talk about counterterrorism, where for the first time in a BRICS summit, Pakistani militant groups, terror groups were named in the joint statement. So I think, there are areas of cooperation and there are areas of dispute between India and China. It's important that we work together in the areas of cooperation to build on it, and the NSG is an area of difference, and both India and China need to have a discussion on this.
But in the process of globalization, China's global stakes are expanding very fast. That's why we send a flotilla to the Somali waters to escort international oil tanks as well as fighting piracy. Do you think our presence, the military presence in the Indian Ocean is viewed by nationalist media in your country as a threat?
I have written 2 books on the Indian Navy, and I don't think that India feels that the Indian Ocean is India's ocean. It is, it's
very much like the way China doesn't think the South China Sea is China's backyard.
So if you look at the Indian Ocean, it's a huge, vast area. Spanning, Eastern Africa, right through Southeast Asia, Australasia, to the north. There is no way that one country itself is able to exert influence in this region. And, if you're looking at connectivity, at trade, development issues, navigation, you need other countries. So what I think the view is that clearly India has geographical advantages in the Indian Ocean because it is located in a very strategic area of the Indian Ocean, which covers both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal as well as the Central Indian Ocean area. And it's important that there is clearly, there needs to be a sort of a security architecture for the Indian Ocean. At the moment, that security architecture is missing. So what we do have, and this is again what the Indian Prime Minister raised yesterday, that we're talking about an attempt at a collective security arrangement through something called the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium or regional cooperation through the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So India is very clear that this is really an area that it needs the cooperation of other countries.
But fortunately, chemistry between the 2 paramount leaders is very good, between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. We have other issues concerning our formidable presence and investment in the Hambantota port of Sri Lanka, Gwadar deepwater port, which is very close to the Persian state, and China depends very much on the Gulf oil supply for the sustainability of our economy. Are you serious about the so-called Pearl conspiracy theory? Is it a subject matter for the media fanfare in your home?
I think this is one of the concerns that India has, and the Prime Minister yesterday alluded to it when he talked about, it's just not about infrastructure, but it's about building trust and concerns over countries going to debt. So there is a view that this is something that needs greater transparency. And at the moment, one of the issues on Hambantota particularly is that there's a lack of transparency as to the amount of investment, nature of the equity holdings, and there is concern over this. But I think it is very important to have a dialogue and discussion on these issues. As there has been in other areas of cooperation, for example, both India and China have been cooperating on counter-piracy operations. They work together in certain areas of the Gulf of Somalia. So there are areas where there are concerns, such as what is happening in Hambantota, particularly in terms of the debt issue. But there are again areas of cooperation that need to be built upon.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue with Mr. Roy Chaudhury, a senior research fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies based in London. This organization also hosts the annual event of ShangriLa Dialogue. It is also called Asian Security Dialogue. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, sir. Let's take a look at the domestic politics of India. Now, what do you think of the future of BJP? That should be viewed in the context of his reform of currency and tax reform.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to understand that when the BJP came into power 4 years ago, it was elected in India by a decisive majority. For the first time in 30 years, the BJP was the single party that had the largest number of seats in parliament and a majority of seats in the parliament. So the BJP came in 4 years ago with a decisive mandate. And over the last 4 years, it has actually increased the control of the number of states within India from 8 states in 2014 to 20 of India's 29 states. So in the last 4 years, there's been actually sort of a greater control of the BJP, not only in the federal parliament, but also in the states. This is the situation that the BJP is now using to go into the next election, which will likely to be held in the summer of 2019. There are two aspects to India's domestic politics at the moment. The first is the economy. The economy has grown at a rate of about 6.5% average in the last few years, 7.4% this year and a bit more next year. But the economy has grown with concerns over employment. So there hasn't been an equivalent increase in employment. The second issue is that in terms of the opposition parties in India, they are very weak. The leading opposition party, the Congress party, is still fairly divided. So on these two bases, one is that the economy is doing well but hasn't created the jobs it should. Second, that the force multiplier for the BJP is the opposition party. The BJP is well positioned to move forward to the next election, possibly win it, but as most observers believe, with a reduced majority in Parliament.
Prime Minister Modi is accused of practicing demonetization. What is your opinion?
You know, it was a controversial decision at the time, clearly, where 85% of India's currency was demonetized very suddenly, and there were hardships for several days and weeks. But I think what it did show was an attempt by the Prime Minister to seek to end corruption, which is a very powerful mandate that he was elected on. And secondly, I think to try to push the economy into a more electronic sort of means, where you have more reliance on the credit card system, etc. It wasn't a popular measure at the time, but it did not lose him any elections, and also it provided an opportunity for India to fast-track itself into the electronics stage, which still hasn't fully happened. But most critically, it affected economic growth only for 2 quarters. So there was a setback economically, but that is now overcome and the growth rate continues. So overall, if we look at it with hindsight now, yes, it was a controversial measure, yes, it was a tough measure, but actually it may well have been a measure that was required, but it could have been done possibly in a less controversial manner.
The one-party politics in China allows our high-speed railway to be constructed easily, but India is a democracy. You have so many lobby groups, opposition forces in the parliament. It won't be an easy job. What do you think of the issue of infrastructure? Despite the promising future that China will invest, will help invest in India, and Japan stands ready to help as well. So you face more opposition and difficulties than in China. How do you assess the adversity of such situation?
Well, you know, the Prime Minister is very clear that he wants to build a new India. You know, he wants a transformation of India, where there are houses for everyone, there's more economic growth, development. For this, it is very important to ensure that his party has a majority not only in the federal parliament, but also in the states. So what this means essentially is that by getting control of a larger number of states, he's able to get a larger number of seats in India's second chamber of parliament called the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. Once he's able to get some support in both these houses, it is much easier to change laws including on land laws, which are controversial. Because for India, and the Prime Minister admits this, it is very important to get investment. Because unless India is able to get foreign investment particularly, its growth will be impacted at some stage. But foreign investment requires India to move forward on land reforms, which are very controversial. But the only way to move forward on land reform is by getting a majority in both houses of parliament, or at least a coalition of majorities, possibly after the next election. So it is much more difficult. It has not been resolved. It is a tough task, but there is a way forward. We'll have to see if that works or not.
Now, what's the global vision of Prime Minister Modi? Is India a regional power or a global power with the fast economic growth that surpassed China in the last quarter of 2017? Do you think India will become yet another economic superpower in the foreseeable future?
I think India's economic growth is what is leading its impact on global affairs. So India does very clearly have a large vision for itself and its role in world affairs, particularly as we've seen yesterday in the Indo Pacific region. But it is very different from what India had a vision earlier. Earlier, India's vision was a non-alignment and being a leader of the non-alignment of the non-aligned group. Today, in this government of Prime Minister Modi, the word non-aligned is not used. Non-alignment is not used. It's very clear that India now sees itself as being a responsible player in the international community, of having a larger role in the security of the region, especially in terms of the Indian Ocean, but also, as we've seen yesterday, a larger role in terms of defining the Indo-Pacific. So definitely, yes, India has a vision of itself as a leader in a larger space, but in a very multipolar setting. I think that's something that India has urged. And again, Prime Minister Modi made it very clear that it shouldn't be that any one country dominates. But though he didn't use the word multipolarity, the Indian view has always been that.
But does Prime Minister Modi see eye to eye with American President Donald Trump about putting America first, buying America, hiring Americans? I mean, this is the bilateralism as opposed to the multilateralism that the Europeans and Chinese, and I believe your Prime Minister, all support.
Each country has its own perspective on this. For India, India puts itself first. I mean, there's a whole program, Make in India.
But does it mean automatically treat protectionism?
No, it doesn't.
On the platform of populism?
No, it doesn't mean that. But at the same time, it is important that that a country like India, where Prime Minister Modi is undertaking a huge transformation for trying to alleviate the poverty that is there, will at some stages focus on itself. I think investment is a particularly important example where it is essential for India to get the foreign investment. Now, if the investment is going somewhere else, then that does affect India, and I think it will try to compete with other countries effectively to ensure that it becomes the destination of the investment rather than going anywhere else. So in many ways, India will, for its economic development and prosperity, will have to also look inwards on certain occasions.
One more last question before we conclude this useful brainstorming about the security issues. What do you think of the success of IISS in organizing the annual event of a ShangriLa Dialogue, and how do you compare the ShangriLa Dialogue with the Munich Security Dialogue in Europe?
This is my 14th IISS ShangriLa Dialogue that I've attended. I've been attending these virtually right from the start. And I think that this has really become the most important dialogue on defense diplomacy for the Asia Pacific, now the Indo Pacific in that sense. This year we had the keynote address by the Indian Prime Minister. We had the largest ministerial-led delegation, so we had 25 country delegations led by full ministers, defense ministers mostly. 10 additional countries delegations were led by deputy ministers. So what we've seen, and I've seen this personally over the years, is the traction that this dialogue has been able to get over the years, where defense ministers, military chiefs, intelligence chiefs want to come back to it in greater strength and have, I think, free, frank discussions to meet. IISS is proud of the fact that we are able to focus on three mission statements for us. One is our work research based on facts. The second is the analysis that we're able to provide, which is value added. And the third is influence. The IISS Shangri-La Dialogue actually epitomizes the influence that the Institute has been able to exert in the Indo-Pacific region, and no other dialogue, I believe, matches what we do at the Shangri-La Dialogue in terms of the convening power, but also, most importantly, of the IISS as a strategic actor in international affairs.
What about the Munich Security Dialogue?
The Munich Security Dialogue is largely based on Europe. It does not have the focus on the Gulf region, on the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. So it is an important dialogue, but it is really limited in its outlook. And if we are looking at the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, as well the future engines of growth, it's not the Munich Security Conference to attend, it is the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue.
The Germans would accuse you of being a patriotic Indian and a bias against the European security affairs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.